Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ray Cross, Vice President for Intelligence, AFCEA International.
Welcome back. I hope you were able to spend time with our exhibit partners during the break. Their support is crucial to our program's success. We have a diverse lineup of speakers for our first breakout: information warfare, politics, pandemics, and public discourse, who will examine Russian and Chinese efforts to create social divisions, influence elections, and undermine America's global image. To kick off the program, it is my honor to welcome Rob Douglas, CEO of Scope Now, who will introduce the moderator of our panel. Over to you, Rob.
Hi, my name is Rob Douglas. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Scope Now. We are an analytical search engine that uses social media data to detect threat, risk, and fraud in real time. We're really excited to be here, a part of the Intel Summit 20, being a part of the information warfare session. We like to help elucidate facts and make sure that the information online is clear and attributed to its sources. So it's really relevant that we're part of this process. We're going to be introducing Dr. Jim Ludes from Salve, Regina University. He's the director of Pelley Center for International Relations and Public Policy. I'm going to hand it over to him, and he's going to lead the session.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jim Ludes. I am Vice President for Public Research and Initiatives at Salve, Regina University, and Executive Director of the Pell Center, which is a think tank on the university's campus. It's my real pleasure to be with all of you today, virtually as it is. We've got a tremendous lineup of experts for this first breakout session: information warfare, politics, pandemics, and public discourse. Before we get started, I just want to say a quick word of thanks to Larry Hanauer and his team at the Intelligence and National Security Alliance for inviting us all to be a part of this conversation. We're thrilled to do so, and we want to thank him for all of his efforts. I believe you have biographies of all of the panelists, so I'm not going to belabor this too much, but I do just want to give a couple of quick words of introduction for each of them, and then we'll really dive right into the conversation. Daniel Kimmage is the Principal Deputy Coordinator for the State Department's Global Engagement Center. He leads U.S. government communication efforts designed to counter terrorist recruitment, state-sponsored propaganda, and disinformation. Laura Rosenberger is the Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Rosenberger previously worked as the Foreign Policy Advisor for Hillary Clinton and has served in multiple positions at the State Department and the National Security Council. And Dr. John Kelly is the CEO of Graphika, a social media analysis firm that blends social network analysis, content analysis, and statistics to make complex online networks understandable. He was co-author of a 2018 report prepared for the Senate Intelligence Committee regarding Russian disinformation in the 2016 presidential election. So it's a great crew with great perspectives. I'm going to kick this off, though, by asking Mr. Kimmage if he could just share with us some 30,000-foot views of the work of the GEC and what you're focused on these days.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So the Global Engagement Center takes its mission from the 2017 National Defense Authorization Act, which charges us with directing, leading, and coordinating the U.S. government's efforts to counter propaganda and disinformation by state and non-state actors. So let me just unpack that a little bit. The major focus is really Russia, China, Iran, and still, as you noted, terrorist organizations, which is ISIS, Al-Qaeda, their affiliates, and increasingly racially and ethnically motivated violent extremist organizations. So we are developing the Global Engagement Center as a mission center that is very much in growth mode at the moment. We see ourselves playing a critical role in the U.S. whole of government effort to counter propaganda and disinformation. If you would take one word away from this, it should be partnership. We really see ourselves as working to support and empower a network of partners in the interagency, international partners, civil society, and the private sector. And that is the Global Engagement Center in a nutshell. So back to you, Jim.
We'll go deeper and get into some of the more specific details of your work, but let's ask the same question of Laura Rosenberger. Laura, could you give us an overview of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's great to be here with everybody today. So the Alliance for Securing Democracy, it's a bipartisan and transatlantic effort that is aimed at developing tools to better understand and to counter the suite of asymmetric tools that authoritarian actors are using to undermine and interfere in democracies. So for purposes of today, the information manipulation suite of tools, and we can come back to terminology later, but I'm going to talk about information manipulation common because I think it's more encompassing. Information manipulation is one of the major tools and tactics that we have seen actors like Russia, China, and Iran that Daniel just named using for foreign policy tools, largely that fall beneath the threshold of conflict, where from ASD's perspective, the national security community has in the past had trouble with grappling with both how to understand the challenge when this is a contest that's really playing out on private sector and civilian battlefield, and where responding symmetrically, responding in kind, is really not a road that we can or should go down as a democracy. And so lots to come back to there, but that's basically sort of what the alliance is. And we work very closely with John and his team, as well as colleagues who are in the government as well. So just to end on that point that Daniel ended on as well, the importance of partnerships in dealing with this problem set. I'll just sort of note that there as well.
That's a great segue over to John Kelly and give us a quick overview of the work that he does and his team does at Graphika.
Thanks. Well, I'll take this opportunity to give you a brief indoctrination into the world as Graphika sees it. So we call ourselves cyber social cartographers, and that's because we are pioneering with machine learning and large-scale data analytics, the mapping of what we call cyber social terrain. So humanity evolved in geoterrain. All human collective activity, whether it's warfare or trade, happened in a 2D plane strapped around a sphere. And that human coordination takes communication, which happened at the speed of a horse or a boat or someone running down a pathway. And with the invention of the telegraph, we were able to punch a hole directly through geoterrain and have real-time planetary scale communications. And now that happens with these little things that we carry around in our pockets. So that means we live in a new type of terrain where human collective activity is shaped by these vast and complicated networks that form based on people's decisions about who to like, who to friend, what to follow, et cetera. And that's the world that's the primary, call it battle space of state contestation these days, with things that are happening that are invisible to the eye, but they're very real in the way that they impact society. So that's the brief indoctrination. What we do at Graphika is we're a technology company, so we have advanced tech that maps out these very large-scale patterns of connections, and that enables some fairly sophisticated forms of analytics. And then we try to bring that in to play to be a good partner with the partners at Stanford, Alex Stamos's outfit, and many, many others in this space. We try to be a very good teammate to in kind of bringing our secret sauce into their recipes and their work.
Super. Thanks, John. So let's get into some of the specifics and some of the guts of this conversation. Now, Daniel, I'm wondering what you're seeing now about foreign efforts to shape opinions, to shape influence, particularly around the election, around pandemics. That's probably 30 minutes of conversation right there. So let's just start with those two broad issues about the pandemic and about the upcoming elections.
Sure. So on the pandemic, the major thing that we've been observing in recent months is, of course, Russia and China are both leveraging all of their investments to shape and disrupt the discourse. What we're seeing a bit more is a certain thematic convergence, and to a somewhat lesser extent, a tactical convergence. So we are seeing similar themes coming from Russia and China, and we are seeing a certain adoption, particularly by China, of Russian tactics. But it's important to remember that both of them approach things a little bit differently. I'll illustrate that with a bit of means and ends. So in Russia, the end tends to be more disruptive. So the Russians have created a disinformation ecosystem that generally seeks to disrupt. We detailed this ecosystem in a recent report called Pillars of Russian Disinformation that identifies 5 elements in the ecosystem. There are the official mouthpieces. There are the government-funded entities and outlets. Then there are the proxies where the government hand is more disguised. There is also the weaponized use of social media. That would be the famous troll farms that have garnered so much attention. And then lastly, there is cyber-enabled disinformation. So this would be hack and dump operations and the like. Important to bear in mind that this ecosystem operates as a whole. Researchers tend to look at one part or another because you need different tools, methodologies, and expertise, but it's really one entity, not perfectly coordinated, but it is an ecosystem. With China, the end is more a reshaping of the global discussion to support the expansion of China's geopolitical footprint, prestige, etc. So it's less disruptive and much more shaping. China has also developed an ecosystem. That ecosystem is more weighted toward the official end of the spectrum than the Russian ecosystem, although recently we've seen, and our own analysts have detailed, the use of more what I would describe as, Russian-style tactics, troll farms, etc. So that's a very brief overview of some of what we're observing recently.
Super, thank you. Laura, I wonder, through the work of the Alliance for Security and Democracy, if you've had an opportunity to look at what's being pumped into the U.S. ecosystem right now, less than 2 months before Election Day.
Thanks. Well, I think Daniel gave a good overview and drew out some important contrasts there between different actors. Jim, I'm going to reverse your question a little bit in a way, because you asked what is being pumped in. And I think that's a natural way of thinking about the question, given how we all understand the Russian interference operations in 2016 occurred. But what's really happening right now is sort of what's being pumped out, oxygenated, and re-injected into the bloodstream. We have really seen, essentially, as the domestic disinformation ecosystem has metastasized and grown in new and different ways, and really kind of seeped into the bloodstream of the American public discourse, that in fact there's very little that needs to be purely injected from the outside. And so if I may add another of my fun analogies here, the way I think about the interference operations that we're seeing, particularly from Russia right now, is that maybe in 2016, or really, again, as John and his team have detailed, and as the intelligence community has detailed, what we call the 2016 operation really started back in 2013 or 2014. But that operation, right, there was some really dry tinder and maybe a couple of sparks, and the Russians really helped kind of light that fire and make it take off. And it's been burning and growing into a big conflagration over the past 4 years. And now what we see is Russian actors essentially, usually in much more covert and targeted ways than the big broad scale stuff that people think about from the IRA troll farm, sort of squirting accelerant in certain parts of the edge of the fire. So say you want the fire to burn that particular town over there, right? This is probably a really bad analogy to be using as part of, large parts of the west of the country are burning. And so I apologize for that. But squirting a little accelerant in one direction just to drive a very particular piece of the conversation in a very particular direction, and then just kind of see it go up again in flames. And so it's a very different dynamic. So that's probably a little bit less about, I think you were probably asking a little bit more about sort of a narrative direction there. But I actually think understanding how the tactic has evolved is really important, and the way this domestic and foreign ecosystem really can't be separated as two distinct things when it comes to the foreign operations. It's a little different when it comes to China, but even there, if you look at a lot of the kinds of operations that Daniel was outlining at a high level around COVID-19, a lot of the Chinese official propaganda and information operations around COVID-19 was really taking some of the authentic domestic debates about the handling of coronavirus, whether the administration has mishandled parts of it, debates about the stay-at-home orders, things like that, and using those to weaponize back to us. The last point I'll make on this, and then I'll stop because I've gone on long enough. We have started to see, and Daniel alluded to this, a bit of an evolution of China's tactics. And it's hard to say if this is a permanent shift or if this is a sort of the moment thing. But we have, for the first time, started to see China's information operations start to engage on more domestic-focused issues. So things like the protests around police brutality and anti-racism in the United States. And one of the interesting things that we've seen there is essentially picking up on this theme of, trying to discredit democracy through using these narratives. And it's a very similar thing to what we see in COVID-19, right? China's trying to create this construct this external construct, which is already done internally, that the Chinese Communist Party and the system that it has grown is the best equipped to provide stability for people, to provide stable government, to provide security, to be able to quell a pandemic, to be able to deal with violence in the streets or keep it from happening in the first place. And so again, even what we see with China is a use of these authentic domestic narratives and debates being manipulated for their own purpose. So I'll pause there.
That's very helpful. Thank you, John. I in one of our pre-interviews before the panel, you had said something that really struck me. You talked about in terms of the cyber social terrain. You said, and I think I got this right, that we're already at war. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us? And I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. Well, if you think, what we see coming from the Russians is often a kind of 21st century version of what the Soviet Union was doing for 100 years in terms of, doctrine around propaganda and active measures. And all of a sudden that sort of intent and those sets of psychological techniques and, manipulating media techniques meet the kind of perfect medium, which is American 21st century technology platforms. And once they sort of started to be successful there in the manipulation of the internet or the cyber social terrain, there's really, it's had a massive impact. And, I think back to before Graphika, I was helping to run a research project at Harvard's Berkman Center, and part of what we did was apply kind of very early versions of the technology and techniques we use now to mapping out Russian weblogs and Iranian weblogs and kind of the Web 1.0 modes of online discourse. And we saw, kind of when we first started, Russia's own discussion space was extremely free. Lots of different kinds of political opinions, almost nobody pro-government, but four different ways, four ideologically incompatible ways to want to get the Soviet or the Russian Empire back together and all kinds of other stuff. And we saw as they started to manipulate, and that started by kind of hiring commercial spam bloggers. And then quickly they moved on to automating social media accounts when social media got big. But what you saw was a very early investment by the government in techniques of manipulating online discourse. And this is going back to 2010, 2011, a lot of this stuff, and the weblog stuff even longer. So we found it surprising. The public found it surprising what happened in 2016, as was then revealed in the next couple of years as more information came out about that. But it ought not to have been surprising at all. That they have been engaged in manipulating kind of the online social fabric for since beginning of when they could.
Interesting. Well, and I want folks to know too that I get to have a lot of fun lobbing questions that I want to ask at these folks, but you can be part of the fun too. So if you've got a question, make sure you submit it through the portal, and we'll try to curate those and ask as many of those as we possibly can before this panel session is over. Daniel, listening to both John and Laura, I'm thinking in your role as the U.S. government representative on this panel, what is the U.S. government doing? What is the GEC doing to be able to combat this threat as we're sitting here?
Sure. So, it's a whole range of activities that pivot a little bit off of the specifics of the actor. So let me start with Russia. Let me start with what's true to all of them, which is we're doing a lot of analytic work to identify and alert people. So we've developed a team of data scientists, an analytics and research team that is constantly producing internal reports, generally unclassified and open source reports. Some of these are at the request of our embassies out in the field to help them get a better sense of what's happening in their information environment. Others are pivoting off of things that we observe. Earlier this year, we did a report identifying Chinese linked inauthentic activity, coordinated that seemed to be supporting statements by Chinese officials. So there's an analytic component to this. Secondly, and probably more importantly, is our network of partners. And this network of partners is across the board from within the U.S. government, where we've got all of the various parts with their authorities that can help to make a difference, but also a huge range of organizations abroad, some of which are academic, some of them are here in DC. We've worked with some research organizations. We recognize that the US government is almost never the most credible communicator when it comes to actually pushing back in the information environment. We can speak credibly to policy and we can speak credibly to U.S. positions, but when it comes to really making a difference, you've got to find people in the local environment. This is a lesson that I'd say we learned the hard way in our decade-old experience of countering violent extremism. It's a very obvious thing, but it took us a long time to identify. You really need to work with local communicators who understand the environment. So, we are doing some of the same things here. I will say that we are very much aided by two things. First of all, there's enormous expertise out there. We see this reflected in our panel. Some of the most insightful and cutting edge work is coming from places like, Laura's team and Graphika, et cetera. Secondly, there are genuinely concerned people who do not want to see Russian trolls or Chinese false narratives pervade their information environment. So there's no need to astroturf this effort. It really is grassroots. There are these partnerships out there that are, I think, very crucial. So the last thing, and probably the least interesting, well, probably quite interesting to the participants in this event, is, of course, U.S. government coordination. It's mainly meetings, it's emails, but it's a very crucial part of what the Global Engagement Center does, working with our colleagues in government broadly to coordinate across the spectrum of our authorities and activities to ensure that the whole of our effort adds up to more than the sum of its parts. That's really how I would define this. So I'll leave it at that.
Excellent, thank you, Laura. I'm listening to that though, and I'm wondering, what's the role for the American public in responding to this threat?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, there's a huge role for the American public in responding to this threat. But let me come at that a couple of ways. So one is, I want to back up and give you a bit of my conceptual framework for thinking about these. John gave a great outline of how he sees the world. And I concur with pretty much everything he articulated. The one thing that I would say is, and I'm not sure, I may be an outlier on this panel on this, but the panel is actually titled Information Warfare. And my view, and I've written about this, so if I can propagandize for myself, I had a piece in Foreign Affairs that talked about this issue and a follow-on in the Washington Quarterly earlier this year. But where I believe that information warfare is the wrong frame for democracies. And in fact, I believe it is the frame that authoritarians are trying to impose to advance their model of the information space as one to be controlled and manipulated. So we're talking here about tactics, right? We're talking here about the ways in which these actors are using the information in cyber domains in order to advance their interests, to exert power, and to undermine and weaken democracy. But that involves seeing information, not just the zeros and ones of data, but the content as well, both of them, as tools, as utilitarian things that rest in the hands of government and that shouldn't be allowed to flow freely to people. And in democratic view, information inherently rests with people. That is what is core to deliberative debate in democracy. And if we start allowing ourselves to see information as a weapon, to see the information space as a weaponized space, as a space for warfare to be conducted, I believe democracy is going to lose. Now, that doesn't mean we can leave these domains uncontested, right? And so it means we need to think about our own frameworks of how we contest the information space in a way that affirms, advances, and protects the democratic sphere, right? Now, where did the citizens come into that? Because that's where you started. So I didn't forget your question, I promise. There's a real piece here. I mean, at the end of the day, putting people back in the center of the information space has to be the answer, right? If in a democracy, information rests in the hands of people, it rests in the hands of journalists who protect the First Amendment, who are for the state, right? It rests in the hands of citizens who are freely exchanging views and opinions, even when we don't like them. We need to have a space where that exists. That means government can't control the information. It also, frankly, in my view, means that algorithms and sort of online surveillance systems that shape our information universe, right, John, with the phone that's shaping our information environment. People aren't at the center of these right now. And what we need to do is find longer term ways of enhancing transparency of information, of giving users greater context, of giving them the greater ability to control and understand the information that's coming at them. Now, that's not the near-term solution that you probably were looking for of, how can individuals spot the bots and trolls in their feeds and all that. And the reality is that that's hard, right? Like, John's research team is fabulous at determining all this, but it's incredibly hard to do that. And so what I think people need to do at a basic level is, one, search out and identify credible sources of information, right? I say that in that way because some people will say, be skeptical of what you read, all this kind of stuff. And I would just point out that, in fact, what Russia wants is, in particular, for us to begin to doubt all information, right? If there is no truth, and my colleague Peter Pomerantsev has written, very eloquently about this. If we begin to believe there is no truth, then again, democracy loses. So credible sources of information, being active in democratic spaces, right? Again, these actors want us to lose faith in institutions. So actually that testament of faith by participation is incredibly important. And then I think the other thing is, I think and I may be a little Pollyannish on this, but a lot of Americans have decided to choose convenience sometimes over when we know, for instance, that the environment around us is being shaped in a way that might not be constructive to a healthy democratic discourse. And at some point, I think we as a society are going to have to make choices. When we have groups on certain platforms that are simply known to be rife with information that is conspiratorial and leading people down radicalization rabbit holes, is that really a way that we want to continue to exist as a society? And I think individuals need to start really standing up and saying that. We're seeing a little bit of that through some of the campaigns around Facebook boycotts. There's an Instagram boycott being organized today around certain concerns about disinformation. And I think we're starting to see greater awareness from people of the downside risks of some of these technologies, but we need to see more of that.
So, John, it segues into something else that we've talked about, which is the sort of the constitutional barrier, some of the societal barriers that we face in the United States about meeting this challenge. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. It's easy for me to kind of riff off of what Laura was saying, I think, because I fundamentally agree with her. And if we end up just seeing, our online discussion commons as a battle space, we've already lost, right? And what we need to, I think, distinguish between, and so obviously we have a lot of things that make it difficult for the United States of America in particular to respond to this foreign threat, right? One of those is called the First Amendment. Others are called, very rightly constituted privacy protections. There's a whole bunch of our core values that these kinds of attacks are great at just sliding through the cracks of, and we have to get much more sophisticated about thinking that problem through. And so one of the key things to recognize there is that the biggest disinformation threat and online manipulation threat facing American democracy is not coming from foreigners. It's coming from Americans, right? The volume of this activity, call it, if we could use Facebook's terminology, coordinated inauthentic behavior, is the majority of that activity is coming from American sources. And that's everything from, on the better side of the equation, just technologically sophisticated, partisan volunteers, to for-hire political-oriented PR firms, to even more possibly subterranean actors who just don't want to be caught at it. But there's a variety of folks that are doing this domestically, and the fact that they are able to get away with it makes it so much easier for the foreign foxes to, run across the unmowed lawn undetected, right? So if we could get a handle on it here, I'd almost say it's a prerequisite to getting a handle on it domestically before we're going to be able to effectively protect ourselves from foreign sources of the same kind of manipulation. Now, how do you do that when you've got something like the First Amendment? So the way we think through this at Graphika, and to throw another conceptual framework on the table, is something we call the ABC framework. This is the brainchild of Camille Francois, our Chief Innovation Officer. It's a way of dividing the sort of space up that in a way that helps you understand it, both for analysis and detection, but also for ways you might be able to do some remediation. So A stands for actors. So who's doing it? Is it the GRU? Is it the IRA? Is it the Iranian National Broadcasting Agency? Who is it? So that's the actor. Then there's behavior. Who's doing it? What are they doing? Or how are they doing it? Are they running troll farms? Do they have thousands of automated accounts? Do they have sort of sock puppets embedded in political communities? Are they hacking material and releasing it through a proxy? All these different methods of impacting online conversation. And then there's the content. Is it a deep fake? Is it a hacked document? Is it just a meme? And a lot of the constitutional stuff and the right, the First Amendment protects the C level. You do not want to be actioning or doing, combating information operations in a way that is restrictive of speech, right? You just cannot do that. The layer that you need to watch, and this is what we pay most of the attention to, is the behavior level. What does it look like? So we'll apply technology to say, what does it look like when these 10,000 accounts that were pushing some campaign are behaving the way 10,000 natural human beings would behave, or they look like 10,000 accounts controlled by some smaller number of actors, right? And we've got technology that goes with that. It's trying to understand what are the online assets that are coordinating to push an operation that you want to look at. And so just like the Facebook policy against coordinated and authentic behavior, I think is exactly the right way to think about it. You need to determine where you have a number of assets controlled by one or a small number of entities that are behaving in a coordinated way, kind of a secret hand behind the scenes coordinating their activity, and where is it inauthentic? In other words, it's also critical that they be something other than they're pretending to be. And you focus on that, not on kind of what the content layer is. Although you can often understand, where the bad content's coming from. The bad content can kind of give you some breadcrumbs to figure out what those networks are.
Super. So we've started to get some questions here from the audience, and I've got literally sheets of paper full of questions that I could throw at you. But let's get to the questions from the audience, and if we've got some time in the end, I'll execute the chair's prerogative and keep asking my own. But here's a question, and let's maybe start with Laura on this one. Some U.S. officials have stated that Russia, China, and Iran are all attempting to influence the U.S. presidential election. Which of these countries, in your estimation, poses the greatest threat to the integrity of the election, and why?
It's a great question. And I would start with just a couple of points. We've seen a couple of statements, particularly from Bill Evanina, the head of the NCSC within the intelligence community, giving some high-level public detail of the primary threat actors that the IC is concerned about: Russia, China, and Iran. I would note a couple of things. One, in those statements, Russia is the one that is identified as actively engaging in operations to carry out its intentions. Two, the Treasury Department last week designated several individuals. The first was Ukrainian pro-Russian, actually identified in the Treasury designation as what has been long suspected, a Russian agent named Andrei Derkach, as well as three operatives who were overseeing cryptocurrency operations for the Internet Research Agency, of course, the well-known troll farm. So, all signs appear to me to be that Russia remains the most significant threat to the U.S. election. Now, let me sort of put that in a little bit of context, though. John's probably heard me riff on this before, so with apologies to him. But in general, my view is that seeing these kinds of operations just in terms of elections is the wrong way of understanding them. These are ongoing operations where Elections are essentially, let's talk about sort of foreign interference operations as a chronic condition that have acute manifestations, right? And the acute manifestations are around elections because we have election infrastructure that's involved. We have a particularly heightened political environment. You have certain high stakes outcomes. But if we even go back and look at the intelligence community assessment of the 2016 operations, you know, Russia had three goals in those operations, and one of its primary goals was to undermine confidence in the integrity of U.S. democratic institutions, right, and of the election itself. So I provide that as the frame, which is to say that I think China and Iran are doing a lot of malignant ongoing operations that are harmful to our democracy. But when it comes to that acute election-focused kind of activity, all signs are that Russia remains, the most significant threat. Now, again, to put that against another backdrop, how significant is that in terms of, when compared against the domestic operations that both John and I spoke about? And I think it's important to understand, again, that these are two sort of interlocking dynamics that are hard to parcel out. They're all equally deleterious to our democracy. But the last point I would say is, well, I'll say two last points. Sorry, just kidding. The one is, I think sort of maybe undergirding the question was a little bit of this question of some of the allegations of politicization that's, there's concerns about when it comes to the way that these issues are being discussed. And just 2 points on that. One, my view, I mentioned at the top the program that I run is a bipartisan one. I believe very deeply that this issue of foreign interference is fundamentally one we have to approach in a bipartisan way. Allowing this issue to be politicized is the single biggest roadblock to actually addressing it, and is one of the single biggest vulnerabilities that our adversaries exploit. And I say that, again, noting another part of my bio that you mentioned is having been Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor, right? So I don't come at this from a naive perspective, but I believe deeply that we cannot politicize these issues. That being said, those designations that I just talked about from the Treasury Department last week were done under an executive order signed by President Trump in September of 2018. EO 13848, for any of you who really want to dig into this out there, was an executive order that President Trump signed that allowed for the imposition of sanctions for a wide range of activities that are targeted at elections, building on a narrower piece that President Obama had put in place. So I do think that that's my, let's have a little hope there, and let's try to keep this from being politicized. And my last point on this is going to be that while I do think there are real threats to the election, the biggest goal here in the scenarios that worry me the most are the ones where essentially we've become so primed to think that there has been something malign that's occurred that we begin to doubt the system ourselves, right? And so I think even while talking about, these threats and what's most significant and whatnot, it's really important to bear in mind that the whole point of these operations is for us to lose faith in the integrity of the election process. And so one of the most important things we need to do is try to bolster that faith and resilience in it.
Excellent. Thank you, Laura. Daniel or John, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry.
Let's go with Daniel first, and then we'll come back to John.
Sure. Let me start by enthusiastically endorsing something that Laura said earlier, which is this framework. And, the framework that we get comes through our legislation, but it's very similar to what she articulated in that our legislation specifically notes that we need to be promoting fact-based narratives and taking an approach that is based on partners, the whole focus on partners and working collaboratively as part of our legislation. It's not this negative warfare framing. That's out there. That's a part of the environment. But it doesn't play to our strengths, and in the end, it's not as effective. We do a lot to encourage resilience because resilience, in the end, is the antidote to a lot of this. And we try to facilitate. We don't always have the best tools, but we do try to facilitate, an educated populace, people who have critical thinking skills, skeptical, source-conscious readers. That's really what undermines a lot of these propaganda ecosystems. So I just wanted to endorse that as an approach. And then lastly, just to say in terms of bipartisan support, we have been very lucky in that the legislation that created us was bipartisan. It was Senators Portman and Murphy who created the Global Engagement Center. So we benefited, and it's helped us a lot in our work.
John?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Laura said by saying the most impactful and dangerous stuff is not the things that are being done to impact an election a few months from now. That is worrisome, and we ought to be vigilant in doing everything we can to stop it. But the really insidious threats here are long term. You know, it's like if you hack an election, you win an election. If you can hack a culture, you win all future elections to come, right? Is the way I would look at it, to paraphrase an old parable. And you look at the way, particularly the way that certain online communities that each had their own kind of life and energy and centers of gravity, some of them fed by kind of Russian operations for years, things like the conspiracy community, the anti-vax community, the 5G tech conspiracy community. A lot of these things have now sort of spun together with COVID. You know, so you're able to sort of inject or just harp for years on certain narrative threads, build that out, and then those narratives create community around themselves, or they inject themselves into and become components of adjacent kind of cultural spheres. And then at certain points, those can start to come together and gain greater force. So with COVID in particular, what we call the COVID infodemic, you've had a kind of crossing of energies between some of these different kinds of conspiratorial communities, such that now they've got their own lore and thinking that's all interwoven, things that formerly were very, very separate. And that doesn't go away, you know, after election day. You know, that's with you for all time. And so we call this this sort of approach, we call it the Narrative Trellis. We haven't published on this yet, so you're getting a little bit of a concept sketch behind the scenes of Graphika, but where you can sort of start to scaffold certain things with your operations in a way that then natural, organic, domestic community and narratives start to grow on top of, and then you could just take the trellis away and the thing is self-supporting. So I think that is the long-term threat, and that's what is worrisome past November for sure.
You know, I'm listening to this conversation, and I'm going to apologize to the questions that I don't ask with this question, but listening to what you're describing, John, and frankly what all of the panelists have discussed, you're describing a set of instruments, a set of tools that can really achieve strategic effects. And so I'm curious what you think the strategic objective of a Russia, of a China, of an Iran, as precise as you can be, what are they trying to achieve with this set of tools?
Well,
we'll start with John and we'll go around the horn.
I'll just throw, you can tell I like metaphors. I mean, I think that the Russian approach, unlike the Iranian and the Chinese approach, which tends to be focused much more on their own sort of slate of national security and foreign policy priorities, the Russian thing is much more intrusive to the body politic. I mean, they're really trying to sort of cut all the tendons that hold the body together so it falls apart. I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Laura?
Sure. So in brief, I would say, it starts from thinking about the strategic, geopolitical strategic orientation of these countries themselves, and then where the, strategic use of this domain fits, right? So Russia is an objectively declining power on almost every measure. And Vladimir Putin's primary and really probably only real goal is maintaining power. And there's a lot of ways that he does that. But one of the ways is by discrediting democracy abroad, sorry for my alerts popping up, by discrediting democracy abroad, by showing his people that, in fact, Russia is still relevant on the world stage and able to actually achieve things, and by weakening his competitors, right? So splitting them apart from each other, splitting NATO allies apart from each other, weakening his perceived competitors from within, right? When we're in chaos, when our democratic pillars are crumbling, we are less able to assert U.S. interests on the world stage, to act strongly and cohesively as a country in advance of U.S. national security interests and objectives, right? So that chaos and destruction, right, which I think Daniel sort of mentioned earlier, is really characteristic of how Russia engages in this space. China, very differently, and again, Daniel sort of mentioned some of this, is really trying to construct a world or shape a world that is one that is advantageous to the Chinese Communist Party. And that involves a number of different things, but one of them is enabling greater control of the information sphere. It's reshaping norms, including around information, in a way that's useful to it. And through both what Russia and China are doing in particular, we see what I would talk of is in terms of the transmission of norms or sort of governance models, if not as a deliberate sort of export, but sort of as an effect of what they're doing. And so we see this in places where you begin to see this sort of authoritarian approach to information creeping into spaces. But there is also a more active effort by them if we want to pan up just, again, one more level beyond this tactical approach. For instance, Russia and China have worked together at the UN to advance a new cybercrime treaty that would essentially take the authoritarian model that Moscow and Beijing have domestically of controlling, monitoring information, essentially erecting borders around cyberspace and the information space, and begin to inculcate that in a multilateral framework through the United Nations. Now, that's a process that's advancing, and we'll see where it goes, but it's another one of these examples of where, on a strategic level, there is an attempt to reshape the governance of information, the governance of cyberspace in a way that is more favorable to autocracies and is deleterious to democracies. 2 seconds on Iran, because I think it's quite simple. I mean, it really is about, as John said, their sort of domestic interest in advancing those in a much more narrow way. We've seen Iran begin to toy around with some of the sort of Russian style stuff, right? They've done some covert ops on social media, impersonating political figures or picking at scabs on divisive issues, but they've gone for the low hanging fruit. It's not been particularly sophisticated or advanced, and certainly not at scale. They do have some more significant cyber capabilities that they've used, of course, in different ways, but we haven't seen them apply them as much in the space of attacking democratic infrastructure as we have other actors.
Daniel, do you want to elaborate?
Sure. So let me touch on something that we haven't discussed, which is the way that Russia seeks to manipulate the information environment domestically is quite different than what they do abroad. And domestically, abroad, there's a general consensus that they are very disruptive abroad. They tend to focus on disinformation. But domestically, there is a more positive message. There is a weird and idiosyncratic ideological bent to it that draws on rather strange interpretations of Soviet history and Russian history in this kind of Putinist ideology. But it is more of a positive project, and it's tailored to an audience that's very, very different than abroad. Abroad, of course, Russian foreign policy objectives really need to be the primary point of entry in analyzing what they do in the disinformation space. I think there's a danger of putting the cart before the horse if you start to get too carried away with the troll farms and the tactics. You really need to take a step back and look, what are they trying to accomplish, be that undermining a democratic system or some more specific project. With China, let me draw a sort of alliterative distinction and say that, Russia is perhaps more invested in disruptive disinformation abroad and positive propaganda at home, whereas I won't speak to the Chinese domestic space, but abroad, China is far more invested, I would say, in classic propaganda, in pushing these big narratives that China is a rising power, a dependable partner, is doing great things. That's kind of classic propaganda. It's not the kind of tailored, very specific disinformation. So I think that there are some interesting things. And just to build on, I can't remember, I think it was Laura who mentioned, there is some interesting overlap. We know that Russia's state-controlled news agency Sputnik has some agreements with Chinese media outlets to exchange personnel and content. We know that Russia and China have held media exchange forums for the past 5 years involving government officials and media agencies. So there is some exchange of tools, techniques, and practices in addition to the thematic convergence that I highlighted earlier.
So, Daniel, I want to stay with you on this next question, and it boils down to: is the manipulation of public discourse via social media a tactic that is uniquely effective in the United States, or have other states executed similar campaigns elsewhere abroad? And there was another question in the feed, in particular about the Brexit vote. So, can you say anything about how other populations have been similarly influenced?
Sure. So let me start with a caveat about the Global Engagement Center's mission and work, which is that we are focused on audiences abroad. That's a function of our legislation. It's a function of Smith-Mundt. It's a constraint. So we don't analyze the environment inside the United States. All of the activities we fund are directed at audiences abroad. So with that caveat, every society has fissures that can be exploited. And there are, of course, examples of Russia seeking to do that, of China seeking to do that. On the specific question of the Brexit referendum, we have not done an assessment of that. I can't speak that. I will flag that this question of specific impact is one of the most difficult parts of this whole endeavor. Identifying this, and colleagues who've really dug into the analysis can confirm this. Even if you can attribute an operation, even if you can really gather as much, it's very hard to assess what the impact is. And that also affects some of the things we do to counter. So I think we're making progress on that, but it remains, I think, one of the outstanding challenges in this field.
This next question is for John, and I'm going to give Daniel an explicit exemption from this question. And when he hears the question, he'll know why. But John, you co-authored the report for the Senate Intelligence Committee on Russian disinformation. Is Congress engaged enough on this issue? And if not, what else do they need to do?
Well, I can just tell you my own experience. I think Laura is probably closer to probably walking the halls of Capitol Hill more than I am. But my main touch points are with a few of the key committees. As you know, we've done some analytic work supporting the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, and we're in fairly regular contact with some of the key staffers there. And I think that they are as attentive, engaged, and sophisticated in their thinking on this as you could hope for. And some of the key members on those committees are certainly as well on both sides of the aisle. Now how that ripples out into the rest of Congress and how the American political system works, I'll let Laura take that one. Laura,
you want to dive in?
Thanks, John. I appreciate that turd being thrown at me. Thanks for that. Just kidding. John and I had the privilege of testifying alongside each other in Congress in one hearing, which was great joy. No, I would agree with what John said on key members and key committees. That being said, I think that there is still, number one, a gap between those members who've really dived into this topic and been able to kind of wrap their heads around it, and the broader, membership of Congress. Number one. Number two, I think there's a few challenges we face on this issue set. I tried to put the positive spin on bipartisanship before. I'm going to be a little more negative here. Despite the fact that numerous pieces, dozens of legislation with bipartisan co-sponsorship have been introduced in Congress over the last two Congresses, past 3.5 years, to address different parts of these issues, almost none of them have passed. There's been some authorizing legislation, like Daniel mentioned, for the GEC and the NDAA. The more recent NDAA also had a number of interesting and useful provisions around these issues. That is the exception to the rule. And a lot of other pieces of legislation that could be very helpful in addressing parts of these issues have languished in part because of partisanship and the politicization of these issues. But I think there's also something that's even more complicated than that going on here when it comes to Congress. And there's a parallel when it comes to the executive branch, which is I don't believe that we are organized right around this issue set. This set of issues crosses so many congressional jurisdictions. And similarly, this issue set crosses so many different parts of the U.S. government. Now, Daniel mentioned all the great interagency work that the GEC is engaged in working with partners and authorities and all that. And I commend him and his colleagues for doing, as wonderful a job as they have done. But my own view, and I say this having spent, over a decade in the executive branch myself, and a good bit of that working on some of these issues from the National Security Council. I think that around a whole host of issues that are, call them the 21st century new era issues, whether it's climate change, whether it's technology, whether it's all these different things, we just need to think about wholly different structures, frankly. And in areas like this where domestic and foreign policy are increasingly converging, where this wall that we've been accustomed to building between these two policy domains really no longer exists. I think that we have to think about new and creative ways of restructuring ourselves, again, within the halls of Congress and within the executive. Now, I'll just footnote one really important point when it comes to the information space, which is that given all the very important points that John made about the First Amendment and about things that we need to be doing to protect Americans' ability to say and receive what information they want, particularly and most importantly on political issues, right? We need to be sure that anything we do that sort of collapses that very sacred, domestic speech that needs to be occurring. But as a broad question, I think that whether it's in the halls of Congress around jurisdiction on issues or whether it's within parts of the U.S. government structure, we need to think about new and different ways to make sure that we don't have gaps and seams between us that prevent us from making really important policy in an expeditious way.
Folks, we've got literally about 2 minutes and 45 seconds left in this panel. So I want to maybe just run around the horn once with some final thoughts. Before we do, I just want to thank the Intelligence and National Security Alliance again for the opportunity to be with all of you today. I also want to note a little point of propaganda for myself. With a great colleague, Mark Jacobson, he and I produce each week a open source newsletter on disinformation and influence campaigns called Active Measures. If anyone was interested in receiving that, it's free and you can unsubscribe easily at any time. You could send me an email, just jim.ludes@salve, that's SALVE.edu. So let's go around the horn. We'll start with Daniel. Some concluding thoughts, 30 seconds.
Sure. Let me just give some reasons for optimism. When I came back to the Global Engagement Center in 2017 in January, there wasn't a single person working on Russia, on China. There was no money, there was no team, there was no structure. Now there are dozens of people working on this. There are millions of dollars in projects. There's a huge amount of activity. It's just a start, but we've made an enormous amount of progress. We're seeing some real initial operational successes. I think our Russian Pillars report was important. Some of the work we've done to expose Chinese false narratives has been very effective. That said, for the reasons that my fellow panelists have identified, there are still huge problems with propaganda and disinformation that are rooted in societal phenomena that we can't look just to the executive branch or just to government to solve, which is why their work is so vitally important as well. Thank you.
Super, Daniel. Thank you. Laura?
Well, I'll kind of stick with Daniel's optimism, or at least try to not undermine it. But I would just say that my own view is we spend so much of our time thinking about how we're going to counter these kinds of tactics. And when we do that, we are inherently putting ourselves in a defensive and reactive frame. And my own view is we need to be investing a whole lot more time and really creative thought and energy into coming up with our own affirmative strategies for advancing a stable, secure information space that is conducive to democracy. And so now, these aren't either ors, right? You can't just have offense or defense and et cetera. And I'm not even sure offense and defense is the right framework in this space. But I do think that building on some of this great work that's been done, the real challenge for us now is to come up with what is our strategy. We know the Chinese strategy. We know the Russian strategy. We know the Iranian strategy. We know their doctrines, and they're actually not hard to find. But we need to understand what our own is. is, right? And to really articulate that in a forceful way, and to do that in partnership with our allies. I think that's another piece that's been missing, and where we need to be doing much more. And so I think that that's where we'll start to be able to maybe move from the heel to the ball of our foot.
John, 30 seconds, bring us home.
Well, just kind of, again, riffing off of what my co-panelists have been saying, I think that what we need to do is think about what does good look like, right? So not just how to be defensive, but as Laura says, where are we trying to go and what does good look like? I'll tell you a little bit about what I think it looks like. I think that all the techno-optimism around in the early days of the internet, this idea that you didn't have to own a newspaper or television station to say something publicly in a democracy. There's a lot of very sort of positive thinking before, it turned around and bit us. And what's happened is that nefarious actors, foreign and domestic, have gotten very good at creating, overwhelming those true signals from real people with fake signals from fake people. And we need to fix that. And fixing that is collaboration between a whole lot of different parts of society, so we need to think through what are the norms that we need in place around how do we control this on the internet and make it a good place and not a bad place. And I think that it's firmly rooted in an idea of authenticity, that you ought to be able to, you should not be constrained in what you say online, and everybody should be able to participate, but you ought not to be able to launch 2 or 1,000 or 20,000 accounts that are pretending to be something that you're not, to say something at scale. And it's not a speech issue. It's more akin to consumer fraud, right? It's more akin to hiring people to pretend that the shampoo actually cures something it doesn't cure. If we can see it as kind of fraudulent conspiracy as opposed to limiting speech, I think we're headed in the right direction.
Well, I want to thank the panel again, Daniel Kimmage, Laura Rosenberger, John Kelly. Thank you all so much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Dr. Ludes. And thank you to all the panelists for a terrific discussion on a critical issue that continues to unfold every day. This concludes today's events. The summit will reconvene tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, when we will hold our plenary on military service intelligence priorities. You won't want to miss that discussion because it'll feature all 6 of the service's intelligence directors, to include the newest military service, the U.S. Space Force. Please take time now or tomorrow morning to visit the exhibit hall, where you can explore more than 50 virtual kiosks to learn more about the innovative services and technologies being applied throughout DoD and the IC. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.